what they're for. Okay, so spinal cord, spinal nerves. And then the last part of this set of notes is autonomic nervous system. Spinal cord and spinal nerves is what you are doing in lab this week, right? Unless you had Friday lab and then you started it last week, right? Okay, so this directly correlates to what we're doing in lab, so say thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I had to move all of my lectures around to make this happen because you guys kept telling me that that's what you needed. Okay, so the spinal cord obviously is going to link the brain to the peripheral nervous system, right? That's its primary function. But it also does a little bit of processing on its own. It doesn't do any intellectual processing, but really low-level integration functions can go on at the spinal cord level. And it produces some of your simplest reflexes, but these reflexes have to be subconscious and involuntary, right? Because there's no consciousness at the spinal cord level. So let me show you a typical spinal reflex. There's a bunch of spinal reflexes, of course, but this is a typical spinal reflex, and that is this. Okay, so this is the patellar tendon reflex, and so if I can get my leg to relax. What is happening there, FYI, is it's going straight through the lumbar region of the spinal cord and straight back out to cause the motor activity. It's not involving my brain in the decision-making process at all. The only reason that my brain is aware of it is because what happened is you did the whole thing and then you sent up an electrical signal to your cerebral cortex so that you could have awareness. But it's really like asking forgiveness, not permission, right? You took the car, you brought it back, you handed it to your parents, and you said, I took the car. And you're like, there's no, like, so why send it up to the brain at all? Because you're still collecting sensory information about the world around you, right? You still want to know what's happening. So reflexes are faster than this. This is voluntary activity. And reflexes are way faster than that. So spinal cord does some reflex activity, some low-level processing, and I'll show you how that works a little bit later. So let's just look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. So first thing I want to tell you is that on each campus we have at least one, and on Jordan campus we have two beautiful spinal cord dissections, in which what they did is they took off the spinous process and the lamina from the posterior so that you can see the spinal cord. They reflected the dura mater back so you can see all of this. It's really, really good to look at it. It's not very common to see a spinal cord dissection. And then on Jordan campus, we have both a posterior dissection and an anterior dissection of the spinal cord, so you can see it from both aspects. So make sure that instead of just looking at models, you actually go look at the cadavers, okay? So gross anatomy of the spinal cord. It's hollow because it has the central canal in it. What's inside the central canal? Cerebrospinal fluid. So it's hollow. It's kind of cylindrical, not exactly round, kind of flat. And it's way, way tinier than you expect it to be. It's only about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch wide. It's like anatomically like that. And it goes from the foramen magnum, which is kind of an arbitrary boundary because it's really just continuous with the medulla oblongata. It goes from the foramen magnum all the way down to about L1 or L2. Now, most people think that your spinal cord actually goes all the way down because your vertebrae do, right? Your vertebrae go all the way down to your sacrum, and then your sacrum is actually part of your vertebra. But your spinal cord doesn't go that far. Your spinal cord, if you can feel your last ribs, your spinal cord goes down to about L1 or L2. So it ends pretty high, right? And that matters, of course, clinically, because if you have damage, right? If you have your vertebra that actually slide past one another, if it happens above L2, then it can have CNS damage. If that was below L2, it's probably going to cause nerve damage, but it's PNS damage. Does that make sense? So that is significant because, of course, the PNS has a much, much higher likelihood of having any regeneration over time. So because the spinal cord ends at L1 or L2, it ends up being about 16 to 18 inches long, but that's like variable based on your height, right? So if you're a professional basketball player and you're like 7.5 feet tall, it doesn't end right here. Like it grows as you grow. It still ends at about L1 or L2, so its average is about 16 to 18 inches long. And so as far as anesthetics and spinal taps, The reason that we do them in the places that we do them have something to do with where the spinal cord ends. So we already talked about an epidural injection, and so let's just talk about that briefly. And then we'll talk about a spinal tap and how they're similar and how they're different. So if you were going to do an epidural injection, for instance, during childbirth, right, what you would do is get a good spread between the vertebrae. Use surface anatomy and anatomical knowledge to count down to find when you're below L2. Usually you would go between L3 and L4, or L4 and L5. And then if you were doing an epidural injection, you would inject the anesthetic into the epidural space right there, the fat, right? But, does that make sense? This is not an epidural injection. This is called a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. That's what this is trying to show you. Spinal tap or a lumbar puncture is actually going to try to get some cerebrospinal fluid. Let me show you why you can get cerebrospinal fluid, because in the spinal cord, where the spinal cord ends, the meninges do not end until about S2. Does that make sense? So, if I wanted to examine cerebrospinal fluid for microbes, bacteria, pathogens, chemical content, white blood cells, right? Also potential cancer screenings, then I would want to get it from the least invasive part possible. Of course, I could get it from around my brain, but hell no, right? Could get it from around my spinal cord, but hell no. So the least invasive place, and of course it's a circulating pool, right? So if you get it from one place, it's just as good as getting it from anywhere else. So you would go down here and do a spinal tap. And in order to get into the cerebrospinal fluid, you would need to go through two meninges. What are they? The dura mater and the arachnoid into the subarachnoid space. Does that make sense? And you'd suck it out, and then they would examine it. And for instance, what if you had all of the symptoms that could be a combination of the fluid and neck injury, or you could have meningitis, right? They can examine your cerebrospinal fluid. And they could not just tell if you have meningitis, but they could also tell whether it was bacterial or viral meningitis, which have different treatment mechanisms and also different likelihoods of communicability, right? Does that make sense? Okay. And so even if you can't see the pathogens, you can also see the types of white blood cells that are in the cerebrospinal fluid. And you guys may or may not know this, but there's a certain type of white blood cell that increases in response to a viral infection, and there's another that increases in response to a bacterial infection. Does that make sense? Or sometimes cancer screening, one of the first steps, if they think you have a central nervous system cancer, like you've got something that looks like a tumor, but I don't know if it's benign or malignant, well, if you go in and take it out of the brain and it was fine, you're like, you can't put it back. The hell do you do? So you're like, whoops. So sometimes one of the first screenings, it's not going to be the final one, will be to take cerebrospinal fluid, because cancer doesn't stay put. And so quite often there are cancerous cells or precancerous cells that are circulating in the cerebrospinal fluid. Does that make sense? And then after that, they can do some more investigations. Okay, so that's a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. And I have heard they hurt like hell. Has anybody ever had one? I've heard. What? You've done them. They pop, right? When you go through the dura mater, it's like so thick that it pops, and people cry like crazy, huh? It's really sad when little kids have to have them, because like, if your child's school has a meningitis scare and you've got any of the symptoms, then they can do a spinal tap for the kid, and it's really, really painful. Go ahead.
So what causes the headache if you can get
From getting a spinal tap? If you disturb the volume of cerebrospinal fluid by even a tablespoon, you disturb the pressure around your brain and cause hella headaches. Right. In addition, sometimes when this is healing, it doesn't close up very quickly and you leak cerebrospinal fluids, and they have to do a little patch, little blood patch on the top of it to help it heal. So if you're leaking, you're gonna be screwed. So if you have a teeny bit too much cerebrospinal fluid or a teeny bit too little, headaches from hell. That okay? Okay. So I should do one on a cadaver so that I could at least see what it was like. I never deal with living people, but I've got all of these people that I can do stuff to, right? I just don't deal with living people, right? I'm actually really good with dead people and books. It's like my best things. Okay, so there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Let's talk about these. that branch off of the spinal cord. Yes? There are 31 pairs. They do not have individual names like the cranial nerves. They have numbers and letters, and they're not even in Roman numerals, so they're not that hard. So let me introduce you to them, and then we'll talk about them in more detail a little bit later. So from the cervical region, they all start with C, right? From the thoracic region, they all start with T. Lumbar are the L ones. Sacral are the S ones, and then there's an extra coccygeal one, and I'll tell you why it's C0 one. Okay. Generally, the rule with these is that they are going to be named and numbered for the vertebra above them, but with the cervical, you end up with 8, even though you have how many cervical vertebra? 7. But you have 8 cervical spinal nerves because the first one comes off right below the foramen magnum. So you end up with an extra one. Does that make sense? Okay. So C1 through C8, right? That's what they're called. And then how many thoracic vertebrae do you have? 12. T1 through T12. Got it? And then L1 through L5, because you have how many lumbar vertebrae? 5. How many sacral vertebrae? 5. Yeah, they're all fused, but they're 5 sacral vertebrae. And then the coccygeal vertebra number is variable from person to person. Some people even have a tail, so they have a bunch of cervical vertebra. But so there's only one cervical vertebra, but C1 was taken, so this one is called C01, C01. Okay, so C1 was already taken up here. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's how they're named and numbered. We're going to talk about their functionality quite a little bit later. But basically, these are your on-ramps and off-ramps to the spinal cord in the same way that your cranial nerves are your on-ramps and off-ramps to the brain. Good? And we'll talk about functionality soon. Okay, so let's get into the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Gross anatomy of the spinal cord is easy peasy, super easy. Okay, so first off, even though this figure doesn't represent it really well, it is easy to see on an actual person, an actual specimen after dissection. Let me tell you a little bit, this is no oversimplification, but we'll start here, about what the spinal nerves are doing as they come off. Generally speaking, what the spinal nerves are doing is innervating the region that's just below them, okay? So the ones that are coming off here are, for instance, going to do some of your neck muscles. A lot of the neck muscles that you didn't learn, you get a whole bunch of neck muscles up here called the neck strap muscles that are deep to your platysma. So it's doing kind of this stuff. There's actually a lot of musculature here. It's super hard to dissect out. It's really hard to identify. So these are doing a bunch of neck stuff and one other really important thing. These that are coming out of the lower region of the cervical spinal nerves and the top of the thoracic, they're doing arm stuff. Yeah? Okay. And then these coming out here are doing thorax stuff, but most of the inside of your thorax and your abdominal pelvic cavity has already been innervated by the vagus nerve. Yeah? So they're not doing as much as you would expect them to. And then the ones coming out of the lumbar region are going to do leg stuff. With that in mind, does it make sense to you that even though it's not showing it really well, that the cervical region of the spinal cord is a little chubbier, right? It's called the cervical enlargement. Then it gets kind of skinny in the thoracic region and then chubby again in the lumbar region, right? So it's called the cervical enlargement, skinny through the middle, doesn't have a name, right? And then the lumbar enlargement. Really, because of the arms and legs, right? You've got a whole bunch of processes coming in to and from the arms and legs. Is that okay? So this picture just isn't drawn super well so that you can actually see that there is an enlargement, but it's actually really easy to see. Okay, so now let's move down. Okay, so you have to watch this really carefully. And by the way, this is something that you will really benefit by touching on the cadaver to like reinforce what you're seeing right here, but I'll show it to you in pictures. Okay, so the spinal cord proper ends at L1 or L2, and it ends in a place called the Conus Medullaris. It's a little cone-shaped end of the spinal cord proper, and Conus Medullaris literally means cone in the middle. So let me show you what it looks like on an actual cadaver, and then I want you to go feel it, okay? So gently run your fingers through. So follow my pointer. You ready? Okay. The spinal cord proper is going to go all the way down. So obviously, this is the last rib, right? So you expect it to end right around here. Does that make sense? Okay, so watch. So the spinal cord proper, there's the conus medullaris. Do you see it right here? The cone that goes down here. and that comes back up. It's got little hairs coming out the side, but you've got a solid portion in the middle. Do you see that? That's called the Conus Medullaris. Now, there are a bunch of nerves coming off of it, but those are PNS, not CNS. The spinal cord proper ends in a cone, and it ends about L1 or L2. Yeah, exactly where you expected it to end. You got your landmarks here for vertebrae. Is that okay? Okay, so the conus medullaris is where the spinal cord proper ends. Now, there's a whole bunch of nerves around it, and there's nerves that continue after it ends in the canal. Okay, so let's look over here and then we'll look back. Do you see all of these nerves down here? Yeah? Those are all PNS, not CNS. The spinal cord proper ended right here, but there's still nerves running after it. Everybody good? Those nerves collectively that run in the canal, around, and then after the spinal cord ends are called the cauda equina. Somebody thought it looked like a horse tail, and cauda equina means horse's tail. Got it? Okay, so let's look at the cauda equina over here again. Do you see? So here's the end of the spinal cord proper. The cauda equina surrounds and goes all the way down. That's the cauda equina, okay? That's PNS, okay? And then one last thing, and it's easiest to see on this figure right here, but I'll show you on the drawing as well. There is a string of connective tissue covered with pia mater that extends from the very end of the spinal cord, from the very end of the conus medullaris, and attaches it to the coccyx. It stabilizes the spinal cord, and it's called the Filum Terminal, and it runs in the cauda equina, but it's got a different color and texture. Watch. Follow the end of the conus medullaris. Do you see this thing that has a different color and texture right there? That's called the Filum Terminal, and the Filum Terminal means last hair. That's what it means in Latin. So watch here. Here's the Filum Terminal. Do you see it's in green? It's going all the way down and attaching to the coccyx. Ooh, you got to turn that off. All the way down and attaching to the coccyx. You can see it really easily in the cadaver. You can totally see it in the cadaver. And you can see the difference in color and the difference in texture. Okay, so I'm going to name 3 structures. Only one of them is composed of connective tissue, not nervous tissue. You ready? Conus medullaris, cauda equina, Filum Terminal. Yeah, it's the Filum Terminal that is actually composed of connective tissue. It's not nervous tissue, even though it runs in the same spaces as the nervous tissue. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so Filum Terminal. Everybody good? So the gross anatomy of the spinal cord could not be easier. When you look in the cadaver, what they've done is they've dissected it out. They've also sliced through the dura mater and reflected it and pinned it back so you can see all of the individual structures on there. I think it's really cool. It's a really hard dissection to do because you have to like slice through all of the bones, especially if you go all the way down to the sacrum. Getting through the sacrum is so hard. It's really hard to do. So it's like the first time we had one, it was like 4 of my TAs worked for 6 weeks to get it done the first time. And then I bought a bone saw, and then it didn't take so long the second time. Okay. So, and they didn't know what they were doing either, so they had to research it and figure out what the hell they were doing. It was like kind of fun. All right, so spinal cord structures and cross-section is now what we're going to do. Okay, so that's the gross anatomy, and now let's look at the cross-section. Cross-section of the spinal cord is not hard at all as long as you can tell anterior from posterior. Now, admittedly, it's pretty damn easy to tell anterior from posterior if you have a vertebra, yeah? Of course it is, because if you don't know the spinous process is posterior, I seriously question your studying of the skeleton, right? So, but you don't always have a vertebra, so you need another way to tell, yeah? So you need another landmark that you can use. So I'll teach you the 2 that I use. You can use whatever the hell you want as long as it's true all the time, right? Okay, so the 2 that I use are, please note the pattern of gray matter in the spinal cord. It varies a little bit from cervical all the way down to lumbar, but there are some things that are really consistent of it. To me, it looks like a gray H or a swallowtail butterfly. Do you know what a swallowtail butterfly looks like? Round wings on the top, pointy wings on the bottom. Does that sound familiar? Okay. The swallowtail works for me because here's what happens. Those pointy wings go all the way to the dura mater on the back side, and they're always backwards. So the butterfly is flying the same direction you're facing, okay? So the pointy ones go all the way to the back, and the round ones are at the front, and they never touch the front. That makes sense? At least not in normal anatomy. I'm sure there's somebody that's got it jacked up. But so that makes sense? Okay. So that's a good way to do it. Even if the pattern changes and it does change shape a little bit, those two things are always true. The round one never touches the front, the pointy ones always touch the back. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the other thing that is also true that you can use as a secondary check mechanism is that these are going to be called roots, and we're going to learn them in just a second. This root right here always has a lump on it, and it's the posterior or dorsal root, and the ventral one never does. So that tells you what's dorsal, right? So the dorsal root has a ganglion on it, yeah? And the ventral root does not, okay? So now you've got three different ways that you can use. There's a couple of other ways as well, but they're not always drawn really well. The three ways that I use are the obvious one. If there's a vertebra there, that's telling you, right? There's not a vertebra there, look at the combination of the pattern of the gray matter and the presence or absence of the ganglion. Because the ganglion is only on the dorsal root. Does that make sense? Okay, so with that in mind, let's look here. And it's pretty damn obvious in this picture, but what's anterior and what's posterior here? What's the bottom? Yeah, the bottom is posterior, right? Does that make sense? So two of the three are showing. Now, sometimes all three don't show. For instance, if you still got the dura mater around, you won't be able to see the dorsal root ganglion, but you should be able to see the pattern of gray matter. The other thing that people use, but your textbook didn't draw it very well, so it's not very helpful, is they use, what's it called? Where's that picture? The anterior, this part is called the anterior median fissure, and it's actually supposed to be really deep. And then the posterior median sulcus is supposed to be really shallow, but your textbook drew it backwards, so it doesn't really help anywhere. So the anterior median is like really deep, and the posterior one is like really shallow. But so I just use the other ones because they're dependable on pretty much any figure. Okay, so basically the spinal cord is going to have this arrangement of gray and white matter that's really dependable. You could learn a ton of things about it, but let's just do it simply. First off, the pattern is gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside, kind of the opposite of the brain, right? The brain goes gray, white, and then more gray, right? It's got gray matter on the outside. So this has white matter. Now, concept check question for you. This white matter is going to be tracts, not nerves, because it's in the central nervous system. What kind of tracts do you think it's primarily made of? Yeah, it's mostly projection tracts, right? Mostly stuff going up and down, right? Not exclusively, because there is a little bit of back and forth between the left and the right side, but mostly projection tracts. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay, now, those bastards, there's like 25 different tracts, and they all have individual names and functions, but you do not have to learn them, okay? So, we have to look at the pattern of gray matter and the pattern of white matter, and at this level, it's actually relatively easy. So first thing is the white matter is called different chunks. So you've got anterior chunks, lateral chunks, and posterior chunks, but they're not called chunks. They're called either anterior funiculi or white columns. White columns is what they are, right? Aren't they like just tall white columns that are going up the spinal cord? You can use the word funiculus if you want to, but almost nobody does, and almost no textbook actually uses it as well. This textbook uses it. So I won't expect you to know funiculus, but it's in the textbook. So this would be an anterior white column. Yes? Anterior white column. Okay. These would be lateral white columns, and this would be posterior white columns. Does that make sense? Okay. So after you can identify anterior versus posterior, then most everything is really easy to find on the spinal cord. And then you've got one little area right here that's not really anterior, posterior, or lateral. It actually is connecting the two halves, and this is called the white commissure, which should make sense to you because commissures actually connect left and right, right? So anterior white column, lateral white column, posterior white column, white commissure. Got it? Okay. Now, the gray matter changes shape a little as you move through to the spinal cord, and we'll talk about structure-function relationships in just a second. But it does have some consistency. It's basically like your swallowtail butterfly, And so the gray matter is called horns, not columns. You have anterior, posterior, lateral, and a commissure there as well. Okay, so what do you think these are? Posterior horns. Now, I'm in the habit of saying gray horns because that's where I learned it, so don't get annoyed if I say that. You don't have to put gray in there if you don't want to, but these are the posterior gray horns. These are the anterior gray horns. And these over here are the lateral gray horns. Lateral gray horns aren't present everywhere in the spinal cord, and sometimes they're not super easy to see. But look over here and I'll show you a picture of one with a better lateral gray horn. It depends on where you are in the spinal cord, whether you're going to see them. Not that one, this one. This one has a big lateral gray horn. Does that make sense? So, right, posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, anterior gray horn. What do you think this is called? That's the gray commissure. Now, most commissures are white, but it's the gray commissure. And the gray commissure has the central canal inside of it. Good? Yeah, here's the gray commissure right here in the middle, right? So it's not posterior, anterior, or lateral. Here you go. Here's closer. Here's the gray commissure. Got it? Okay. All right, so now let's start putting a little structure function stuff together. So let's start talking about what's actually happening. So what's really happening, and this is going to be an oversimplification. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the white matter of the spinal cord is primarily mostly projection tracts, but there are a few that are going back and forth. What's the gray matter of the spinal cord doing? The gray matter of the spinal cord is the back half is doing sensation and the front half is doing motor activity. Remember how I told you guys before that the touchy-feely that you learned before on the brain would work in the spinal cord too? So I want to look at the spinal cord. I'm going to reinforce this with going through it in just a second, but just look at it for the first time. So this is showing you sensory information in, motor information out for a reflex. Yeah? Okay. So sensory information in, please note that the sensation comes in the back side and the motor information comes out the front side, right? Okay, so let's look at what is in there. The gray matter of the spinal cord, the dorsal or posterior gray horns contain either cell bodies or part of a sensory neuron and also interneurons. Do you see that interneuron in there? And the anterior ones contain cell bodies of motor neurons, yeah? And gray matter is where we would expect to find cell bodies, correct? That's where we would expect to find it. Okay, so we already did to learn anatomical structures in cross-section. I already taught you guys this. So basically, dorsal half or back half is sensory, ventral half or front half is motor. So now I want to practice a spinal reflex. You ready? Okay, so looking at a spinal reflex with the anatomical structures in front of me. So I want you guys to look at this picture real quick, and I want you to see if you can tell me what kind of sensation and what kind of motor activity this picture represents. Somatic sensation because it's coming from skin, and what about motor? Somatic motor because it's going to skeletal muscle. Yes, that makes sense? So this is a simple somatic sensation reflex, right? And what they're doing is they're poking you with a pin and actually getting a response. These kind of reflexes go mostly, unless you do it on your face, it's going to go mostly straight through the spinal cord and not really involve the brain. As a matter of fact, people can be brain dead and still have some of these reflexes, okay? Does that make sense to you? So it's going straight through the spinal cord. It's not involving any real intellectual processing. So let's follow it through. It's called a reflex arc. So basically the parts of a reflex arc are you're going to have a sensory receptor. This one happens to be a somatic sensory receptor. And then you're going to have a sensory neuron. But let's start putting some structures together with the function. This sensory neuron, its cell body is going to be in the blank ganglion. Posterior root or dorsal root ganglion. And isn't a ganglion where you find neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system? Yes? This ganglion is what in function, sensory or motor? It's sensory. All of the dorsal root ganglia are sensory. All of them are. Does that make sense? So this is a sensory ganglion. So the cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. And then the processes, this axon, this continuous axon is going to run through, what root is this? That's the dorsal or posterior root. Yes? Okay. Okay, so that's called the dorsal or posterior root. And then I am going to synapse in the gray matter with an interneuron sometimes. Sometimes you don't have an interneuron. I'll explain that in just a second. So this interneuron, I'm going to synapse with the interneuron, which may or may not be present. Imagine that when the interneuron is present, it's simply deciding 1 or 0, whether I send the input through or I stop the input, right? So you can either respond or not respond to the sensation. You're not intellectually processing this. You've only got 2 possibilities, okay? So let's say that this interneuron, that's its level of integration. That's all it can do, right? Either send the message on or don't send the message on. Let's say the interneuron sends the message on so that you can get a motor response to the sensory input. You guys with me? Okay. Then what it's going to do is it's going to send it to this motor neuron, this somatic motor neuron. Yes? Somatic motor neuron. And the motor neuron is going to be in the what gray horn? Anterior. Anterior or ventral gray horn, exactly. The cell body of the motor neuron is in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And the axon goes through what root? Anterior or ventral. Does that make sense? Back out to the effector. Got it? Okay, so let's just talk about one last little thing that we mentioned before. This is actually showing you that if there is an interneuron involved, what it can do is at the same time as it sends the impulse through the reflex arc, it can also send up an electrical stimulus to your cerebral cortex so that you're aware that it occurred. Does that make sense? Okay, now, there are even simpler reflexes than this. If you always respond to a sensation with the same motor response, do you really need a switch in the middle? You don't. So you can pull out that interneuron if the response is always the same and you just respond to a sensation with the motor activity every damn time, right? Those are called monosynaptic reflexes, and they're the simplest ones that you have. And sometimes you don't have awareness of them because you don't send an impulse up to your cerebral cortex. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is a reflex arc. So the flow of information in a spinal reflex is super duper fast. Right? That's the whole point, is that reflex is really, really fast. It's definitely not smart, though, right? It's just on, off, 1, 0. That's it. Okay, so now, the spinal nerves and branches. So now what we are going to do is we're going to look at this part. Okay, you ready? So we're going to take that same structure and we're going to follow it out. Okay, so from there, what we will see, let's go to, where's the figure that I want to use? Sorry, I lost it. Where are you? Oh, there it is. Okay, so this figure. So stick with me. So this is where people get really mixed up in vocabulary, and it happens every damn time, so don't let it happen to you. Okay, so we call this a dorsal root, and its function is what? Sensory or motor? Sensory. We call this a ventral root and its function is motor. So that means when they come together right here, they have to be mixed in function, correct? They have to be, because you've got processes from both the dorsal root and the ventral root, right? This region right here is called a spinal nerve. As soon as they come together, they're a spinal nerve. Spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramina, yeah? When you put 2 vertebrae together and you've got the little hole right there, that's where they exit. Okay, so the spinal nerves exit through the intervertebral foramina. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to follow the spinal nerve out to form nerves, right? To form the rest of the nerves in the body. You're not learning all the nerves in the body. You only learn 20 of them. I know it feels like 20,000, but it's not. Okay, so let's put this together. So each spinal nerve, one of the things, and this is where you need to listen and you need to be aware that this vocabulary is problematic for everybody, but it's not going to be for you because you are aware of it. So this is a root, yes, right here. This is a root, okay? This is a spinal nerve. Immediately after you form the spinal nerve, they branch. What is Latin for branch? Do you remember? Ramus, yes. So they branch. And when they branch, they do not separate functionally. They just go to different locations. So you have a branch that goes to the back and you have a branch that goes to the front, okay? But they're both mixed in function. So stick with me. Spinal nerve comes together. It's mixed in function, right? And then I have to innervate everything posterior to my spinal cord and then everything anterior to my spinal cord. Which part has more stuff? Anterior or posterior spinal cord? Anterior, right? That's where most of your stuff is, including your limbs. So this is called your posterior ramus. Yeah? Posterior ramus. Okay? It innervates the skin and muscle of the back. There's not a whole hell of a lot back there. Can anybody hazard a guess as to one muscle that you might innervate? Erector spinae. Did somebody say erector spinae? Yeah, the erector spinae. They're right next to your vertebra, right? Those can be innervated by the posterior ramus. And also when I'm feeling this on my back, right here, that's coming through that posterior ramus. So sensory and motor information to the back, right? You actually don't learn any of the things that are innervated by the posterior ramus. And when you do a dissection like this or this, off all of the posterior rami to see the spinal cord, right? Does that make sense? Okay. There's not a whole hell of a lot back there. I mean, I realize it's important to you because otherwise you couldn't stand up straight. But most of the muscles that you learned are actually going to be innervated by branches off of the anterior ramus, not the posterior ramus. Is that okay? Okay. So the posterior ramus and the anterior ramus. So the anterior ramus innervates structures that are anterior to the spinal cord. And actually what you're seeing right here, guys, is they took off all of the posterior rami, and you're just seeing branches of the anterior rami right there is what you're seeing. Okay, so now let's look. So if you follow the anterior ramus out, the anterior ramus will form big collections of nerves as they're heading out away from the spinal cord. You with me? These collections of nerves, watch them here and then we'll look at each one. These collections of nerves are called individually a plexus. Plural is actually plexuses. It doesn't sound right, but neither does octopuses, and that's right too. Okay, you ready? Okay, so this is called the cervical plexus. It's this little collection of nerves right here, right, that mostly does those muscles that you didn't learn, but there's also one important nerve there that comes out of there. You with me? Okay. Do you see this next plexus, this collection of nerves right there? That's called the brachial plexus. It pretty much goes to the arm. Okay? The thoracic spinal nerves do not form a plexus. They just run parallel to one another. They don't tangle up. Is that okay? Keep going down. This is the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus is a collection of nerves, and if you follow it, it goes anterior to the os coxae. Do you see it? Diving anterior to the os coxae. Okay, and then this one right here is called the sacral plexus, and it's a collection of nerves that goes posterior to the os coxae. Does that make sense? What you're going to be doing in lab this week, among other things, is learning a few nerves out of each one. You don't learn all of them. There's so damn many nerves in the body, but you learn a few out of each of them. The one that you learn the most out of is this bastard right here, called the brachial plexus. I'll start teaching you the brachial plexus today. So do you understand what a plexus is? It's a collection of nerves. Okay, and so now let's start looking at the plexuses. You ready? Okay, so the major nerve plexuses, and these are the plexuses that come off of the spinal cord. There are plexuses elsewhere in the body. Okay, first thing I want to show you is how to recognize a plexus. Okay, so if you have it here, it's kind of easy to recognize, but there's actually even a better way. So first off, I'm going to show you a picture of the cervical plexus. Here's what you do not have to do. You do not have to be able to draw or recognize any of the nerves out of here, because would they look like that in a cadaver or an actual person? There's no way in hell they would look like that. But what you do have to do is you have to be able to recognize that it's the cervical plexus. And all you have to do is find an anatomical landmark to tell you that you are C1 through C5. How can you tell? Atlas and axis, right? Atlas and axis tells you that you're C1, C2. So the cervical plexus comes mostly from C1 and a few fibers from C5, but C1 through C5. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the cervical plexus has a lot of nerves that do muscular stuff and sensory stuff here, but most of those muscles you didn't learn. So when you are responsible for innervation of muscles, it's always muscles that you already learned, right? Okay? The one nerve that you absolutely need to know out of the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. And I probably would not ask you, is this the phrenic nerve? Because that's not what it looks like unless you're just studying one picture from one book. But the phrenic nerve is pretty damn important because it innervates the diaphragm. Yes? So your diaphragm innervation is pretty damn important to all of us, and it comes from here, right? Now, the way that I would find the phrenic nerve in the cadaver is instead of looking up here in the cervical region, I would actually go down to the diaphragm and follow it up. You've actually got two phrenic nerves going to your diaphragm, runs lateral to your heart a little bit, medial to your lungs, and kind of like smashed in there, but you can find them innervating the diaphragm back there, okay? So the phrenic nerve is kind of the exception to the rule that we said is like this kind of innervates this area and this innervates this way area. This innervates all the way down to the diaphragm, right? And of course, that's clinically important, yes? So the diaphragm, the phrenic nerve innervates one muscle and has no known sensory function whatsoever, okay? One muscle that you need to know. And so here's the question. Either from looking at this picture or just from your actual knowledge, because you guys do deal with living people. So where would you have to injure the spinal cord in order to lose innervation of the diaphragm? Complete innervation of the diaphragm. Yeah, above C3. So the memory tool is C345 keeps you alive. Do you see why? Watch, phrenic nerve. Do you see that you can follow some of the processes through C5? Yeah? Some of the processes through C4 and some of them through C3. Yes? So if you damaged right here, you might have some weakness of the diaphragm. If you damage right here, you might be like Christopher Reeve. You know, he was on a ventilator part of the time. He could get off for a little while. It was completely exhausting. Does that make sense? Okay. So this innervation is way up there. If you injured above C3, you are usually going to die. Yeah, before somebody can get to you. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. So that's the only one that you need to know out of the cervical plexus. And now let's do the brachial plexus. And this is where it's going to get challenging for you guys. So I want you to pay as much attention as you can because it'll help you in lab. How many of you guys have Friday lab? So you've already done it. Oh, that's awesome. Good. So now you'll feel good about Friday lab. Before you're like, I hate everything. So the plexus that's going to give you the most trouble is going to be the brachial plexus, but it's actually easy once you get going on it. It's just that you have to know a hell of a lot of stuff out of it. So first off, let me teach you how to identify the brachial plexus on an image. If you were on a cadaver, it's going to be, of course, going to the arm, right? That's where it's going to be going. And with our dissections, mostly we dissected it out so that you can see it in the armpit, right? So that's obviously the brachial plexus. But if you're looking at an image, what would you use as your landmark to figure out that it's brachial plexus? Because it comes from C5 through T1. What would you use as your landmark? Yeah, the first rib. Yeah? Okay, that's what you would use as a landmark to figure out where you are, right? No atlas and axis, right? And don't get confused because C5 can do both. It's got processes that are going up into the cervical plexus and it's got some that are going down into the brachial plexus. So do you understand what I'm saying here, that you can see where it's going? Okay, so you can use a landmark. Let's just do the other two plexuses real quick so you can knock them out. The only plexus that's hard is the one without a skeletal system landmark on it, but you can do it, and I'll teach you how. So this is the lumbar plexus, but let me show you the last one, and then the lumbar plexus will get way easier. This is the sacral plexus. So the cervical plexus has the atlas and the axis, yes? The brachial plexus has the first rib. The lumbar plexus has buccal, it's got nothing. And if you can't identify the sacral plexus, you have not been paying attention, because that's a sacrum, right? So they're pretty easy in that way. Okay, so what you are going to have to do is, for each plexus, and we're going to do the brachial plexus next, you're going to have to be able to identify for me from an image that this is the brachial plexus, right? Okay. In lab is where I really want you to find the actual nerves because that's an actual human, right? But you do need to be able to put structure and function together for both lecture and lab. So you need to know what is innervated by the nerves that we choose. And so the vast majority of the nerves, but not all of them, are mixed in function. Some of them are exclusively motor and some of them are mixed in function. So the brachial plexus, primarily what it's going to do is, The brachial plexus, primarily what it's going to do is it's going to innervate both sensory and motor of the lateral chest wall, the shoulder, and the arm. Okay, does that make sense? Kind of from where it's going? Lateral chest wall, shoulder, and the arm. And it is going to do both sensation and motor activity with most of its nerves, not with all of them. Does that make sense to you? Okay, now, muscles that are innervated are muscles that you have already learned, yes? But you did not learn innervation of those muscles. Guess what, guys? The innervation used to be in the muscle lab. So in addition to everything that you had to learn about muscles, it used to be muscle name, origin, insertion, action, and innervation. So I moved them all to this lab. So as you're hitting this lab, remember how much worse it could be. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we are going to innervate the muscles that we've already learned. Does that make sense? Okay? And by doing that, we will also reinforce the muscles that we have already learned, I hope. Okay? So you ready? You understand what's going on? Okay, so I'm not going to fill in all these blanks for you, but some of you guys may have already filled them in. Yay, good, because they went to lab on Friday. For those of you who haven't done it, it's fine, but write them in your lecture notes, write them also in your lab book, because you know you need to write them twice anyway, right, at the very least. Okay, but there is a logic to it, and the thing that I want to get across today is the logic instead of the memorization. Just acknowledge that you are not going to learn them the first time, right? And you have that experience with anatomy, right? You know that there are quite a few things that you don't actually learn the first time you hear them. You just like expose yourself to them. That's what's going to happen today. So don't expect too much of yourself and don't think that you're an idiot, because you're not, okay? So let's start with the brachial plexus. You ready? Okay. When we are starting with the brachial plexus, primarily overview of what it's doing is lateral, chest, shoulder, and arm. Okay, let's do the easy nerves first. Ready? The easiest nerve, I think, from the brachial plexus, as long as you know what you're looking for, is the long thoracic nerve that runs on the lateral side of the chest right here, and you can see it in this picture. Do you see it? This long thoracic nerve, and you can almost in the picture see what it's innervating. Yeah, the long thoracic nerve innervates the serratus anterior, and it has no sensory function. Everybody okay with that? Okay. You do not have to write all these down. As a matter of fact, you'd be better off just listening than writing them down, because you won't actually get to all of them. Go ahead.
Just to let everyone know, if they want to look at the power slides.
PowerPoints for the lab?
PowerPoints on lab at SLCC. It does go through and bullet point all of them for you, so you can go and write them all down.
Yeah, you can go write them all down. Yeah, and also all of your lab aides and the lab instructors have the key, but I left it blank specifically because I think that you actually need to go find them. Otherwise, you won't remember them, right? Sometimes if you have a completely filled out something, it's not as good as actually going like hunting and pecking and figuring. But I'm going to show you like some ways to predict, and then you can just confirm. So we got long thoracic nerve. Everybody good? Okay. And then the next two are the medial and lateral pectoral nerves. Here's where to look for them. Flip up the pectoralis major and look underneath. There are two nerves under there. Okay. So what muscles do you think that these two collectively are going to innervate? Major and minor. Okay. The big one innervates two muscles. The big muscle is innervated by two nerves. Okay. So the medial pectoral nerve is going to innervate what? Pectoralis major. The lateral pectoral nerve is going to innervate pectoralis major. And then the medial pectoral nerve is also going to innervate the little one. Does that make sense? So the big muscle gets double innervation. Got it? Does that make sense to you? And it's called the pectoral nerve. And it innervates the pectoralis major and minor. Like, it ain't as hard as you think it is, right? And the long thoracic nerve is going over here, and you don't understand it, you don't learn any of the rest of them. Is that okay? Okay. That also has no sensory function. So no sensory function for the first three. Okay. Got it? Okay. Got me? Okay. So now we're going to start to get into where it's going to have some sensory function as well. Okay. So let's talk about the axillary nerve. Okay, and then we'll start actually drawing some pictures on the board. So the axillary nerve, you can see it right here. Here's how I find the axillary nerve. If you open up the cadaver and look here, the axillary nerve dives deep into the armpit, and it's really tight in the armpit. okay? Because what it's actually doing is it's going to the armpit and it's actually going to go up here, okay? So it's not like floppy in the armpit. It's not very hard to find, honestly. Okay, so the axillary nerve is going to kind of do what you would expect it to do. It's going to do two muscles. I want you to guess one of them. What muscle do you think it's going to innervate? It's going this direction. Yeah, it's going to innervate the deltoid. You might not be able to guess the other one, but I can help you with it. Okay, so it's going to innervate the deltoid. It's also going to innervate the teres minor. Does that kind of make sense to you? Right? So up here, okay, it's going to innervate the deltoid and the teres minor. Okay, and the sensory function of this nerve is pretty much the same places because the sensory function is right here. Yeah? So it innervates this activity, motor activity, and this sensation. Got it? Okay? That's the axillary nerve. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so quite often the sensation and the motor activity will correlate. They don't always, but it's okay. Even in the situations in which they don't, you can figure out a way to do it. The way that I do it is I move my body and touch to figure out, to like reinforce what's actually happening. And it makes me look like an idiot, but who the hell cares anyway, right? As long as you pass the class, right? Okay, so deltoid. Somebody tell me what the deltoid does without looking. Axillary nerve. Somebody tell me what it does. Deltoid, teres minor, and sensory innervation, lateral shoulder. Got it? Okay. All right, so median nerve. So now, before we get into the median nerve, I'm going to draw something for you. Okay. We're going to do the anatomy, and then we'll come back and figure out the functionality. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways to do this. When you get into the cadaver, this is going to look like spaghetti. Like, you're going to be like, there's no way in hell that I'm ever going to learn that. But there is an easy way to learn it. It clarifies pretty quickly, and after you learn it once and then check it on 2 or 3 cadavers, you're like, it's fine, I've got this. And the way that I do it, I'll show you guys how to do it. Not the only way to do it, but it's the way that I do it, is, first off, follow me for just a second. Do you see this M? Do you see an M? Lateral side of the M going down, back up, back down. Do you see that M? Okay, all right, so I'm going to draw the M up here, and then we're going to start to identify the parts of the M. Okay. So all the way up, down, continue down, back up, down. Do you see it? Okay, do you see that M? That's what I would look for if I were you in a cadaver when I was trying to identify the parts of the brachial plexus. So let's go ahead and do the easy parts before we do the M, okay? So the easy parts that we've already done are, so this is the arm, yeah? There's one nerve that's going to go down here onto the chest. What's that called? Not axillary, down here onto the chest. Yeah, this is the long thoracic nerve, yeah? There's another 2 nerves that are going to go in right here. What are those called? These are the
pectoral nerves.
Yeah, pectoral, lateral, and medial. Pectoral nerves. Okay, so that's 3 of them taken care of. Then there's one that's going to dive deep into the armpit right there, and you're going to lose track of it. What's that? Axillary nerve. Okay? Okay, so those are easy. And now we're going to start to do the more difficult ones. Ready? Okay, so when you have the M, what you're going to have is the M is going to go up, down, up, down. If you can't find this part of the M, you're not doing it right because there's a million nerves that run in there and you actually have to find the middle. Okay, so the lateral part of the M right here is the Musculocutaneous nerve. Looking at its name, guys, do you think it's sensory, motor, or mixed? Mixed, yeah. Musculocutaneous is basically telling you that it's mixed. Does that make sense? Okay. The middle nerve, which is right here, guys. Do you see this middle one? Follow it down to make sure that you're on the right one. Do you see it? That one is, luckily, called the median nerve. Yeah? Okay. And then I've got one more nerve that's running on this side, and then we'll have one more to add to it. This nerve is running along this side, and you can see it right here. This nerve, yeah, is the medial part of the N, and this is called the ulnar nerve. You okay? Ulnar nerve. And then the only other part of this that you have to know is the radial nerve. The radial nerve is not part of the N. So between the M and those orange ones, you've got everything but one nerve in the brachial plexus. The only one that you have left does not become part of the N. It shoots out behind the M, and then it wraps under the humerus and comes out this side, right? It's even more lateral than the musculocutaneous nerve, and that is this guy. So I'll show it to you here first. Do you see this guy right here? It's coming out behind the M, wrapping around the humerus, and then running really lateral. Do you see that? That's the radial nerve, okay? So the radial nerve is going to poke out behind and come lateral. But it's not part of the N. So if you follow it up and it ends up being part of the N, it's not the radial nerve. That makes sense? Okay, all right. So what we have to do with each of these nerves is we have to figure out which of the muscles we already learned are innervated by each of these nerves and what sensory function each of these nerves has. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so it's not as hard as it looks. It's not easy, but it's not as hard as it looks. Okay, so the median nerve, okay, is what we are going to do first. We already did 1 through 4, and now we are going to do the median nerve. Where is the median nerve in the M? It's in the middle, exactly. So let's find the median nerve. You ready? Okay. Here's the median nerve. Watch where it's going. So do you see where it's going? Okay. So I'm not going to list them all out for you, but I will tell you that they're all listed here, and they're all listed a bunch of different places. It's pretty easy to find them. Again, if the list is super long, remember you're only responsible for the ones that you already learned, right? Does that make sense? So here's what it's going to do. The median nerve is going to go right down the middle and do 6 of your anterior forearm muscles. Anterior forearm muscles. So think, is the median nerve going to be likely to be responsible for elbow extension or elbow flexion or wrist flexion? Wrist flexion. So median nerve does this. Yes? Median nerve. What's the axillary nerve do? This. Yes? Axillary nerve does this. Median nerve does this. That makes sense? Okay, so the median nerve does the 6 anterior forearm muscles, and the digits, the sensory function is a little weird, but it's not too weird, and the way that I remember it is doing this, okay? The median nerve does this muscularly, okay, and these fingers. So if I want to remember what the median nerve does, I do this, because it's got sensory function from these 3 fingers, yes, and motor function right here. Does that make sense? 6 anterior forearm muscles and sensory function right here from this half of the hand. Is that okay? Okay? All right, so if somebody is doing this right here, right, or if you get your finger pricked during a blood draw, the pain goes up the what nerve? Median nerve, exactly, right? That makes sense? Okay, so got it? Okay, so now you can see all the muscles right here. It doesn't do all of them because there's more than 6 of those bastards, you know, right? Okay, 6 of the anterior forearm muscles. So you're going to list out the 6 in both lecture and lab. It's the same ones you're responsible for in both places. Okay, now we are going to move to the musculocutaneous nerve. You ready? Musculocutaneous nerve. Okay, you can look at the musculocutaneous nerve and get a decent idea of what it's doing. Do you see the musculocutaneous nerve? The musculocutaneous nerve runs where in your M? Yeah, it's the lateral side, okay, of the M. And so the musculocutaneous nerve is going to do 3 of your anterior arm muscles, anterior arm, not forearm, okay? So what is it more likely to be responsible for? Shoulder flexion, elbow flexion, or wrist flexion? No, most of it's elbow. I mean, it does have a little shoulder function action because some of them go past there, but most of it. Does that make sense to you guys? So these muscles right here, and you can see them there. You've got the biceps brachii and the coracobrachialis and the brachialis. Do you see that? Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So, but the musculocutaneous nerve's sensory innervation is totally weird. So the musculocutaneous nerve does this, but it feels this right here. So the musculocutaneous nerve, feel here, do this. Feel here, do this. Does that make sense? Okay. Got it? Okay. So musculocutaneous nerve, that's why it keeps going down the lateral side, because it's actually ending up doing sensation down here, motor activity here. Are you all right with that? Okay. So that's the musculocutaneous. To me, that's the one that's the most counterintuitive, because it's like doing something totally different, sensory and motor, right? The axillary is really easy because it does sensory and motor activity in the same place. But the musculocutaneous nerve does this and feels this. Okay. By the way, do you know how I learned the sensation and motor activity with these? I drew them on my body with Expo markers. I had one arm that was for sensation, and I wrote the regions and drew out where musculocutaneous was, and then I actually wrote motor on this side, right, for musculocutaneous, and did the same things for my legs. And Expo comes off really easily, and it's probably toxic, but what the hell? You live in Salt Lake City, you're already being poisoned. Okay. So, ulnar nerve, okay, now we're ready for ulnar nerve. Where are you, ulnar nerve? That's not it. Okay, ulnar nerve is here. So, where is the ulnar nerve in this story? It's the medial part of the M, right? So, we're running along the medial side. See, here's my M, right there, okay? So, what the ulnar nerve does is the rest of the anterior forearm muscles. Most of the rest of the anterior forearm muscles. So 2 anterior forearm muscles. It also goes down and does most of your hand muscles that you didn't learn. Most of those are run by the ulnar nerve. And its sensory function is the other 2 fingers and palms that you didn't get. Does that make sense? What was this half? Who remembers sensory function for this half? That was the what one? That was the median, and this one is ulnar. Exactly. Got it? Okay, so the rest of these wrist flexors, yeah? And these 2 are going to be ulnar, okay? So if you did, do you see what I mean when I was trying to remember? If I do this, it's median nerve because it's sensory here and wrist flexion. But if I do this, it's ulnar nerve because it's wrist flexion and sensory here. Does that make sense? Okay. And nobody can take this study tool away from you. Like you can bring it into every class, right? It's like the cheat sheet, okay? So, I mean, don't write on yourself and bring yourself in because then you're going to have a problem, right? And if you have a really cooperative partner and it's all consensual, you can write on them, right? And then you can wash it off. Okay, you do you. Okay, and then the last one that is in this plexus is the hardest one because it innervates everything left in the arm, and it's the radial nerve. I'm not going to list these out for you, but let me show you what it does with our last few minutes. The radial nerve is doing almost the entire back of the arm and forearm. Okay, so the radial nerve does 3 posterior forearm muscles, yes? 3 posterior arm muscles, 8 posterior forearm muscles. Yeah? And before we go any further, it also does almost the entire back of the arm all the way down to the hand for sensory function. So I always remember this one as far as functionality because what's it going to do as far as functionality if it does back of arm and back of? It's going to do this, right? It's the Ironman. That's the Ironman nerve, right? It extends the elbow and extends the wrist. Yes, that's what it does. Okay, and the entire back of the arm and hand is sensation with what nerve? Radial nerve. Yeah? Okay, so you probably figured out, but the same muscles that you're doing in lab, you're going to be responsible for in lecture. So those are going to be reinforced.